So, Katie, apart from years of underpaid, hard academic work that lends itself to slightly better prospects of securing tenure at a post secondary institution, what is a PhD?
Oh, it's the $1,000,000 question. I would say generally I see PhDs, it's a way to work in research whilst you're still a student. There's always that kind of boundary of like, you're a student technically, but you're essentially, I always considered it my full-time job. And I think it's the first time you really get to take on big research projects as a researcher and really own it. And you own the success, you own the failures, and you really get to live in those outcomes. You're always striving towards them. And for me personally, it was a way to continue my love for research, and of course to move to Canada.
That's fair enough. I mean, Canada is a good place to live in, and research has its own, I guess, unique aspects that certainly are very interesting, but we'll dive a little bit into that and why you're not still working in academia. But that's for later on in the episode. Listeners, as usual, this is Jeff, your host of How It's Med, chatting with the PhD research director and funding catalyst of Thin Air Labs herself, Dr. Katie Greene. Other than working in research of some different sorts, how are you feeling, Katie?
Oh, I'm feeling good. I'm excited to chat about this today, and I like talking about, my start in academia and now my now in the business world, and the
Your turn to the
transition.
dark side. Your turn to the
I
dark side,
turned
basically.
I did, I left, but, no, excited to talk about it. There's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of differences, and, you know, I can't say one is better than the other. I think one is better than the other for me, for
Awesome. Okay. So your story begins like way back when in Ireland, when you started with a bachelor's in biochem. Back then, did you know that you wanted to stick to an academic path, or were there, I guess, glimmers of the traits or wants that you have now that led you to pursue the work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. I was hardcore into research. Like I did my first research project as a third year undergrad in the summer. It was an unpaid position. It was like 3 hours from where I was living. So it was a bit crazy. Went up there, kind of crashed with my brother, would work, Monday to Thursday in the lab and then head back down because I had a part-time job in my hometown. So I just kept doing the transition all summer and I loved every second of it, despite the crazy schedule. And I thought, this is it for me. This is the only thing I'm ever going to do. And then I did a master's. It was still in biochem, but it also had this bioinnovation component to it. So we took courses on like business, marketing, patent law. And at the time, I really undervalued that experience. I thought, this is just the tick the box. Why am I learning about business? Came up with a whole business concept and had to decide whether I myself would become an entrepreneur or whether I was going to chase the PhD journey. And obviously, the PhD won out for me. I really wanted to run a research lab, but looking back on that experience, it was my first exposure to see how scientists could really thrive in business outside of the kind of just industry. Everyone talks, it's like academia or industry, and industry is often, pharmaceutical companies. So for me, it was that first kind of glimmer of could there be something else, but still, was hardcore, wanted to go down the PhD route.
What was the attitude towards working with industry like in Ireland? Because I know in Canada, at least, or in the States too, there's just a general like don't touch that side of science and research within the academic institutions. But Ireland also is home to a whole bunch of pharmaceutical companies. So
Yeah.
I guess, was there more friendliness towards bioinnovation in Ireland, or was it not different from here at all?
That's an interesting question. We like in my hometown, which is Cork in Ireland, we have all the big pharma players. So like Eli Lilly, Janssen, Novartis, they're all there. So the university itself becomes a steady supply of actually biochemists and chemists. So there's a lot of programming within the university, to gear you up. You can do chemistry with pharmaceutical or for pharmaceutical compounds as a degree so that you're really primed. They made a dedicated master's program for biochemists to go straight into the pharma. So I think that path was, it's more clear. They made a direct kind of link between the two, but I would still say that attitude exists. It's almost like a rivalry, right? Like you're either an academic or you're going into industry, and it's such a strange line to draw because one really does feed the other anyway, and that you need both for the innovation to happen. But I don't know. I always thought it was something to do with the money? Like, is it because industry is driven for profit? You know, it's a business. They're looking at the for profit angle, and academics think they're more pure because of the non-profit side of it. And it was really eye-opening for me because maybe I was naive, but I actually didn't know that academics and like industry partners collaborated on research all the time and that it was super common. So when I found out about that, it made a ton of sense to me and it also was really eye-opening.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think there's certainly some historical context that has, I mean, earned pharma some of that, I guess, pushback. Certainly, it's there is context, and we won't dive into it because there's a whole lot to go into. But I guess to return to the topic at hand, you had jumped into that master's. There was a bioinnovation component. Like, what was I guess the biggest takeaway that you had from it? Because you mentioned that it was kind of like, a checkbox for you. Was it something that sparked your interest in bioinnovation, or was it still back then just, oh, it's just a part of the program, part of the process of what I got to go through?
Yeah, I think for me, it was very much the way they'd set it up, and it was a relatively new program back then, was really to show scientists um, how they themselves could potentially become entrepreneurs. How could you commercialize something that you maybe discover in the lab, or you have a great idea? How can you take those skills that you've learned? How can they become transferable? And how does it work with other disciplines? So it was interesting for me because they didn't set up those courses to be solely scientists. We were mixed with business students. I remember there being some environmental engineers. It was just a complete mixed bag of people, and I think that was really eye opening for me. It was like, how can I work on a project with someone from a completely different discipline that doesn't have any idea what I do or the relevance of what I do in the lab? And how can we kind of work together on a project to come up with something really impactful and meaningful? So I think that really opened my eyes to the importance of, what we at Thin call unlike minds. You need to have people from different walks of life, from different backgrounds and experiences in order to make something as impactful as you possibly can.
hmm I guess speaking about unlike minds, what were the first challenges that you had in learning about or completing exercises in the area? Because although you're able to work with unlike minds to explore different aspects of thinking or different tangents from a certain piece of information that you may have, the difficulty is bridging the communication barrier that, for example, environmental engineers may have versus biochemists, etc.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the first things I remember was intimidation. I was really intimidated by um, the language, right? Like you're used to, you learn about amino acids and proteins and all chemical bonds, and I'd be happy to live in that space and have those conversations. And then someone starts talking to me about business plans and market
What's that?
research. Yeah, and I'm like, I know nothing about these things, and I instantly thought to myself, this must be really hard. Like it must be really totally foreign concept. How will I ever understand this? And just getting past that barrier and breaking it down into the basic concepts of what are we really trying to achieve here? What do they know? And then discovering that, honestly, I look at business as one big experiment. And I think if you take that mentality towards it for scientists, it's a lot more digestible. Everything you do in business is, you have assumptions about a market and about a product and how it's going to sell. And your main goal is validating your assumptions, running those experiments, testing, iterating, coming up with hypothesis. So I think for me, it's once I realized what the alignments were, it's a lot easier to understand what the differences are, how to approach the differences, and then how to work with people in with differing opinions and different backgrounds. I think that's part of any industry or any place that you're in. I certainly have had to work with challenging people in academia too. So I don't think that changes.
That's fair enough. Those experiences are pretty common to whatever industry you work in, but I actually haven't heard anyone really uh, compare experiments to the development of a business plan. But you're absolutely right. I've been having a chat earlier today with someone who compared, lean business execution to a series of experiments. So you're absolutely right there. Um, Talking more about why you may or may not have made the right choice. You went from Ireland
Right.
to Alberta, and personally, I think that British Columbia should have been the choice. But why why did you think Why did you choose to go to Alberta, and what were the most striking differences between Ireland and your new home?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I knew I wanted to do a PhD after the master's.
Yeah.
I all my experience to date had been within Ireland and different universities there, but it was, I wanted to spread my wings and see where was next. And really, I was looking at a lot of different places, but Canada and the UK were my top choices. I applied, I started interviewing, and to be very, very honest, I never even heard of Calgary before. But when I looked at the university, it's such an amazing energy. It just really drew me in. Honestly, they have an incredible biochem research program. The whole university has this ambition and still or had and it still does to be, the top ranked within the top ranked universities in Canada. They were investing in innovation. They still are. But what I love the most is they weren't afraid to be outside of the box, and that's such an incredible energy to get from university, especially when you're younger and you're looking for a change. I wanted to come in somewhere. I wanted to be able to play with big, expensive toys in the lab. I wanted to do a project that was a bit out there that wasn't testing a known hypothesis. And then they flew me over for a recruitment drive. I learned more about the program, the city, the researchers. And of course, they brought us to Banff and up to the mountains. So I was pretty sold then. And then my final, what really pushed me over the line was I found out the movie Cool Runnings was filmed in Calgary. That was like one of my favorite movies when I
Wait,
was
it
growing up.
was?
Yeah, yeah, the
How did I not
bobsled.
know that?
Yeah, it was filmed at the Olympic Parks. That was a big plus for me.
That's
But
okay.
yeah,
Okay, that fine. I'll accept that answer as why not British Columbia,
but it's
begrudgingly.
funny. Yeah, the obvious differences though for me are obviously the snow. We don't really have snow in Ireland, and there's a lot of snow, including last weekend we got 25 centimeters in Calgary. But I think there's more similarities between. I know October it was a lot. There's more similarities between like Calgary and Ireland than there are differences. I think the lifestyle here is lovely. It's really outdoorsy, and there's the weather's better, honestly.
Yeah,
But from a university perspective, they're quite similar. Typically in Ireland, PhDs are shorter and more intense usually because it's, you're doing it in 3 years. But
mhm.
in Canada, the one thing that I really valued is the ownership you're allowed to have in a project. You can go into a lab and build a project from scratch and really own that whole journey and that whole project.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think one of the things that you had mentioned in your answer just now was Calgary's focus on innovation, not being afraid to think out of the box. What were the main examples that drew you into the program, that highlighted that attitude, apart from the new toys that you could work with?
Yeah, for sure. I liked the approach they were taking with, some of the institutes that they have. Like I did my PhD within the Snyder Institute, but which is for chronic diseases, and then they also had the Hotchkiss Brain Institute, and they were just leading in even just thinking about neurological conditions and some of the research that they were doing and approaching some of these treatments and looking at things that were, taboo in certain circumstances. They were pretty early when they were funding research into cannabinoids and cannabis use for, various conditions, including like
Truly
MS.
Canadian, truly Canadian.
Yeah, exactly. It fits, right? But then even just like the innovative microscopy techniques that they were doing at the University of Calgary, like the toys that were there were incredible, and the things that they were doing with them was just it blew my mind. And the research lab that I actually landed in with Dr. Robin Yates. He had this project that it was just kind of started as a little kind of observation. And then they proved that it wasn't, an artifact. But they really had no idea what it was. And he had no funding for it per se. But he had enough of kind of the resources within the lab to say, this is definitely something worth exploring. And when he presented that to me, I was like, first of all, I like this guy who's saying, we can do really cool things. Or we don't have techniques to study this. No problem. We'll come up with them. And it's just that type of attitude and that mentality existed within, I think, every researcher that I spoke to when I did come over for the interview. That it's like it's hard to point to very specific examples because it's kind of ingrained in everyone that's within the university.
Yeah, I mean, a couple interesting points there. I'll go back to the whole innovation aspect, and then I'll talk more about the attitudes that you just highlighted. But I guess in your perspective, what's the difference between the innovation that I guess Calgary and the researchers there were doing versus the inventions that they were making in terms of new techniques, etc. Because those certainly aren't the same thing. And I wonder why you use innovation to describe it, other than it possibly being a catchword that universities use to draw more funding and more students in.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that there is quite a sharp difference between, innovation within a research lab versus like invention. And I think that, one feeds the other. I think you need to have an innovative mindset and an innovative approach to create an invention. And I did like that there was a lot of focus on innovation within the university. However, I think they've gotten better with this over time, but I would say this is true for most academic institutions. Um, and one of my kind of frustrations, I guess, with academia is just there's so much talent and there's so much brain power within the academic institutions, and there is incredible inventions happening in there too. And I don't know if it's just like a lack of knowledge or fear, or, there's perceived boundaries and real boundaries about commercializing some of the things that exist within there. And that happens. I've seen it. And there's a lot of challenges there. Like I don't judge people for not doing it. It's just maybe if we talked about it more and there's a lot more support, um, we'd have more inventions coming out. And I actually think that the University of Calgary is doing a good job of putting supports in place. They have this life science innovation hub. They're putting money into a new social innovation hub actually up there as well to support social innovation, not just in the life sciences, right? So
Mhm.
I think that the universities are taking a step in the right direction. But I do think that there's still a bit of a gap.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising at all that that gap exists, given the fact that you said that, that researcher that you spoke with had noted a slight abnormality to the data, that there was nothing to, I guess, work up with quite so far. And the attitude of being willing to take the risk to explore that abnormality, that in itself is entrepreneurial in itself. So to see that there is still some pushback against an entrepreneurial mindset to go beyond research is itself kind of puzzling. I guess from your perspective, what was the role of a PhD in this whole environment in which there was still that kind of pseudo, maybe entrepreneurial environment? And how did your feelings about that role change as you went through your PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually the lab I was in was actually very entrepreneurial, but we were very basic science. Let's like be very clear. It was at the very basic level. So even if it were to be invented, it probably needs another 10 years of solid work to get it there. But I think in PhDs in general, in a lot of labs, they're actually the main contributors to overall research in the labs. It depends on how big, the lab is, if you've got a ton of postdocs and other PhD students in there. But I've seen a lot of situations where where PhD students are the main producers of research in their lab. And I think supervisors, other lab members, they invest a lot of time and resources into training PhD students in the hope that after the kind of the first year or two, not only do those students heavily contribute to the research of the lab, but they're also training the next generation of whether they're undergrad students or masters or PhDs or even postdocs. And I think that's an important role that you take in that as a PhD student in the lab. And I think it just depends on the nature of the lab. I think supervisors have a lot. They're the main provider of the kind of the ethos of the lab, and whether it's going to be more entrepreneurial, whether it's going to be, testing kind of safer hypothesis, just doing what we've always done within the norm, or whether you're going to push the boundaries and explore kind of newer territories. So I don't think my view of the PhD role changed too much over time. I think I was always very clear of what it was. But I think your experience is very varied depending on which lab you're in and what you want to get out of it.
Mhm. I think there's certainly something to be said about the fact that you said the job of a PhD is to get the main learning and actual research down. That in itself sounds like a day-to-day job, not so much entrepreneurial, but rather getting the work done on the ground. So, how did your attitude about that role change as you went through your PhD? Because I'm certain that a lot of the day-to-day experimentation can grind on you after a couple of years.
Oh yeah, it sure does. You're always striving for that couple of percent success. But I think it's like business, right? If you're doing the same thing over and over again and it's not really working and you don't iterate, you're not really going to get far in business. And the same applies to a research lab. You always have to have that somewhat entrepreneurial mindset. You always have to be pivoting, changing. You're never going to beat your head against the wall and do the same thing 100 times if it's working. You have to change constantly. So it's about planning. It's about looking at the information and the data that you have in hand, making a hypothesis, making a plan to test it. Yes, you do have to conduct the experiments, which can be frustrating at times. And then you just have to analyze what you got out and change based on that. So I don't think my role or my view of the PhD role changed over time, but I think my view of the whole field of research and the opportunities that were in it did change. Like I was extremely lucky. My PhD supervisor was and continues to be an incredible mentor, both scientifically and on a personal like development level. And he was really hard on us. Don't get me wrong. Like he's a tough guy to please, and he's an incredible mind. And I think that's what sparked, and helped me kind of cultivate my entrepreneurial side, because he was always challenging the norm. But he takes pride in every person that's, goes through his lab, all of our successes, whether it's within research or, now me in the business world. He takes pride in that completely, and he was a huge component of that.
Mhm. I think that's certainly a unique, I mean, maybe I'm generalizing too hard, but that supportive attitude toward one of your grad students going towards the business world, that may be a unique experience. But I mean, you must have faced some pushback either culturally or personally overall when you decided to go to work with industry. So when you were starting to make that transition, what were the, I guess, misconceptions that you faced, and perhaps what were your favorite ones that you encountered, or least favorite?
Yeah, yeah, there was some pushback for sure. I think because I was so headstrong about wanting to be an academic researcher that everyone, was really surprised actually that all of a sudden, and I don't think I gave people a lot of warning either. It was just kind of night and day. One day I was a postdoc, and the next day I was like, I'm going to go work at a VC firm.
Bit of
So
a change.
my supervisor knew he was in the but some other people weren't. So people were just really surprised that I didn't want to continue down the research path. But, when I explained my reasons for wanting to leave, everybody kind of understood. I would say that the big thing was nobody knew what a VC firm was. So everyone was like, a what? How? How are you going there? Like, how does that transition work? How do you have the experience that's relevant there? And I think it's a fair question, because I also didn't think that it would work. And I wasn't sure when I applied for the job either. And now I've built a team with 3 PhDs and a master's level scientist, and I'm, trying to hire another one. So it's like there's obviously a formula that's working here, where the skills that you're learning in research science are actually working in the work that we do in this VC firm.
hmm So to rephrase that, there was pushback in terms of people not understanding what the overlap was in skills between someone who works in VC versus someone who works in research, correct?
Yeah, I got a lot of questions like, why are you going there? Like, why are you leaving your, 11 or 12 years as a researcher to go and do this? And how does that translate? Were a lot of
hmm
the questions that I got. And people understood when I explained, but it definitely needed an explanation.
So what did tip you over the edge? Because I mean, you certainly had a lean towards the, out of the box thinking that Calgary did. You had that initial experience with your master's. What really tipped you over the edge to join the venture capital world instead of staying in academia?
Yeah, I think towards the end of my PhD and like into my postdoc, I wanted a change. I wanted out of research. It wasn't because I didn't love research. I did. I still do. It was more the trajectory that exists within academia. So I knew that if I were to be competitive as a prof, or to try and get a professorship at the university, then I would likely have to go and postdoc for at least 5 years plus. As you know, the salary is not great for
How many years of
postdocs.
education is that? That's like 4 years of undergrad plus another, what, 5 years of PhD plus another 5 years
Yeah.
of, that's 14 years.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, I did a master's as well. So it's just, I didn't want to be in university till I'm 40.
You
Um,
don't?
and no, not really. But also without the chance of, what's the percentage success rate? They're saying now that it's 1% of PhDs that ends up as principal investigators. And I understand that in that is, people who don't ever want to be a PI, but
That's fair.
you're still taking a huge gamble on something that's lower success. And then if you're, the other roles that exist within academia, I just wasn't super sure that they were for me. And I didn't feel like that there was a lot of opportunity under the academic umbrella for me anymore. So that
Mhm.
was really the big push. And then I just started exploring, like, what am I really good at? What are my skill sets? Where could I apply these somewhere else? And I connected with a bunch of people in my network, heard about Thin Air Labs and what they were doing. And obviously it was a venture capital firm. I had no idea what that was, except for Dragon's Den and Shark Tank, and learned that it's quite different from that. But I took a course while I was writing my thesis, actually, just like an audited an online course on it was called Venture Deals, and I learned so much, and it was amazing. And then as I started transitioning to postdoc, I kind of started doing some contract work on the side, and that turned into a full time position.
That's awesome. So there was a push and a pull. Push from, I guess, uncertainty about your future, and pull being from like the work that VC does, and probably to some part your impression of Dragon's Den.
Yes, exactly. I thought that's exactly what I was going to be doing. I was going to be sitting in the chair every day. Founders are going to be coming in. I'm kidding, but it was there was definitely a pull. I had some connections that had just gotten into the VC world, um, that had told me about it, and how it, there's overlaps with how my skill set could work in here. And I was interested in exploring that more.
If you could be one of the dragons, who would you be?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think I would go with like Mark. Well, I'm going Shark Tank, but I'd go with Mark Cuban just because he's super wealthy.
Fair enough. And also that new like Bilo drugs, I guess company that he started to reduce pharmaceutical costs in the States certainly is really interesting, and I'm definitely keeping my eye on that. But back on the topic. So a quick search can tell anyone that instead of the, like as you said, the monolithic pursuit of roles in academia by PhD students, there's, I guess, increasing interest in entering business as either a founder or in VC, and there have been programs set up by different institutions, such as a group called 50 Years VC, that have helped pave this path. Um, I guess, why does this undercurrent, I guess, exist and grow in the face of resistance from conventional attitudes about the path that a PhD candidate would take? You had mentioned that, for example, the lack of certainty about gaining a PI-ship would be one of those factors. Are there any other factors that you think exist?
Yeah, I think that one's actually huge. I think it's one of the big ones. Um, but I do think that a huge issue is exposure. And I think that, when you're in academia, it's this kind of almost like magical place that you exist in. And it's like a bit of a bubble.
An ivory
Most of the
tower?
people on the team, yeah, most of the people that you're exposed to on a daily basis are, probably spent their whole life in academia. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it just, when you're, when you're looking for something different, you're not always exposed to different, right? You tend to be quite insular. You're often focused kind of even within the lab and sometimes, within your department and your institute. So it can be hard to kind of forge those new connections. And I know that the university here was doing a lot of work to try and expose students to, what are your transferable skills and how do they transfer outside of academia. And then there was a lot of events, there was a lot of speakers coming in. I don't know if it was just me, but I just never really connected to those events or those speakers. And I often just prioritized, my experiments over attending these networking events or various things because I didn't really see the value at the time. I was so head set on going into like staying in academia. I was like, why do I need to know about other careers or other things that might happen? And on a daily basis, my coffee chat or people I were talking to had never had really any exposure to the business world or any other world outside of kind of the academic bubble. Or I think I would say academic or medicine, because those were two quite like intertwined.
Hmm. So, I mean, you talked a little bit about all the forces that push and pull towards and away from academia from a PhD student standpoint. Um, so, I mean, how does it feel to be on the other side, or perhaps you could say the dark side now?
Yeah, it feels really good. There's days where I miss research. I don't think I'll
Yeah.
ever lose my love or connection to it. Um, but now I just really like to appreciate other people's research and what they're achieving in the lab. I think now I get to use those skills that I've built over the last, however many years during my academic tenure and apply them in a completely different way, which is really exciting. And at the same time, it's funny because I still don't feel like I'm fully gone from academia. The first year after I left, I still had a research paper that wasn't published, so I was going up in the evenings and doing some experiments and helping out. Um, and that only got published 6 months ago, so I don't feel like I've been gone for that long, even though I've been physically gone for over 2 years, or for about 2 years. But I do think in contrast to academia, the innovation sector, it just moves very quickly and speed is of the essence. And I really like that pace. Things are always moving, they're always evolving, and no 2 days in business are ever the same. So I really do like that.
Hmm. Hmm. So it seems like there's a pretty drastic change. I guess you had mentioned a little bit about the skill sets that are transferable, and I guess one of the articles that I came upon when I was doing some research prior to this interview was one written by Nathan Bennick. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but basically he tells of a PhD's journey from oncology into VC, and he mentioned some transferable skills. Can you guess which ones he mentions?
Ooh, yeah, that's an interesting one. Um, I guess data is always, I think, one that's extremely transferable. As a scientist, you're always analyzing, right? Like you have to look at the data that's at hand. You have to analyze and make the best conclusions out of it that you possibly can, and justify them. And I think in business, there's a lot of data. Every day we're looking at, the data within the companies that we're working with. And I see our capital team, they're always like analyzing the market data, looking at company data, investments that they've made previously. So I think PhDs are, generally speaking, they're very analytical. They have a really good ability to kind of pair things to the base data building blocks and see how that kind of comes together to make the best decisions, would be
Mm.
one. And then potentially problem solving uh, is one that I think about a lot. I think, as a PhD, you can, as a researcher, even, you're basically ingesting information. um, the information that you have at hand, you're coming up with hypothesis and you're testing it and adjusting it. Like I said, I do genuinely view business as a big experiment. Um, so there's always, as a researcher or in business, you always need to have the ability to take in new information as it comes, identify assumptions, work to validate the assumptions, and continually pivot. But I'm not sure if
Two
that's
out of
what you
three. Two out of three. Two out of three. Not
mean.
bad. Not bad. The thing that he adds is domain expertise.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, from his perspective, working on oncology, of course, there's plenty of applicability. But certainly having some background in terms of like working in, you know, biomedical device manufacturing certainly lends a different aspect. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's plenty of applicable skills, but the ones that you mentioned are the more generally applicable ones, lest you get hemmed into one specific, like really small, tiny subsegment of the VC field overall. Um, Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I totally agree. I just think that there's, yeah, the only other one I would think of is like project management. I think that, if you can't project manage as a researcher, it's very hard to like plan experiment. There's no one else planning experiments kind of holding your hand. You're quite independent as a researcher. And I think that actually transfers really well into any role that you ever do. I think scientists make strong project managers.
Okay, so you're going for the bonus point. I see how it
I mean,
is.
I am throwing it out there.
Try hard as always. So another conversation that I looked at online was one with Dr. Jonathan Tobin, who is a PhD and is now the investment director of Eric's Bioscience. So he mentions that there's immense pressure, and I guess this perspective always being on call in VC, and that it's balanced out by the experiences that you have as a VC in working with like really amazing, intelligent, entrepreneurial people and supporting new ventures. I know that you don't work directly in VC, rather you work in providing the services that support VC, but there's some cross applicability with your experience here. What do you think of this assessment? Is it accurate, or is it just drumming up like hype around the field so that more people come to this field?
So that's a good question. You're right as well. Fitner Labs is an interesting structure. We are one part venture capital firm, but then we do have our startup services, which is where I work. So we're working in parallel and working directly with our VC firm, but we work a lot we actually work with a lot of startups all the time. So
How
for
many?
me, working right now, just on my service line, we probably have about 35 clients we're working with right now. We've worked with
A lot.
over 80 over the last 18 months. Um, so it's crazy, but it's amazing. Like I love
Project
working,
management.
right? Exactly. I love working with startups. You see all the incredible founders, their innovations. This is the best part of the job. I think I look at founders and their job is 24/7. They never stop. And these founders are changing the world, and the impact that they're creating is amazing. So if they're working 24/7, you kind of need to be available for them, not quite 24/7, but typically outside of normal working hours. So it's worth it to me when you get to be a part of any of the victories, whether it's, they get a big client, they launch a product to market, they get Health Canada approval, they close a financing round. It's just so worth it. You get like a tiny part of that journey and you can be there with them. It's infectious, like their energy and that it's amazing. So I just don't understand how anyone wouldn't want to be a part of that.
It seems like a big draw apart from being able to apply your skills in a different, more fast-paced context really is the relationships that you form in VC and I guess, vicarious victories that you get to experience. I guess is that like a fair assessment overall, or I guess is there anything else that draws you? Um, I guess that these relationships do to draw you towards the field.
No, I think that's a really good assessment. I'm always curious, right? Like I love meeting people. I love hearing their stories. Like it always fascinates me how a founder will be, working a 9 to 5 job and suddenly they have an idea and now they're, the next big med tech innovator, or they're making a real estate tech company or whatever it might be. And I've surprised myself because we're sector agnostic, right? So we work across all the different sectors. And I was like, "Oh, I'm only gonna love the life sciences ones or the health ones." And I find myself getting really excited about a contractor procurement and, like, real estate tech because they're solving problems. And the innovations that people come up with to solve these complex problems or sometimes these simple problems, it blows my mind. And I constantly walk out of a room just being like, "That one's my favorite." And then it's like the next day, I'm like, "Oh, no, I have a new favorite." So I love that, having a job where you're able to do that every day is incredible.
Talking about short attention spans, how would you describe VC to a 5-year-old? Just using monosyllabic and bisyllabic words only.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's funny because I have to explain this to the kids in my life semi-regularly. The way I think about it with them is, VC, it's it's a way for new businesses to get money so they can become big businesses. And the example I use, because they're familiar with it, is we all know that Apple is a really big company, makes iPhones and computers, but many years ago they were just starting out. They needed some money so they could build their phones with all the cool features that everyone loves. They're really innovative, and they got money from VCs to make that happen. And when a VC gives you money, they become your partner and they support you and they help you along the way.
So maybe a pushback that a 5-year-old might ask is, don't they make money from sales of the phones? Why couldn't they just do that?
I don't know what 5-year-olds you talk to, but I don't know. Get that far. Well, yeah, you have to tell them about, I often use examples of when you build a house, it's so expensive when you go to the store, all the things you need to buy all at once. So you kind of have to break it down into components of what can you do first, what can you afford, and just helping them understand how much things truly cost. And, if you were one person building a house by yourself, think of how long it would take you to build it. If you had a, suddenly you were able to expand your team to 10 people because you had the money to, look how fast you'd be able to build it. And maybe you'd be able to build it a lot better because you'd be bringing in other skill sets.
Yeah. I mean, the word component was trisyllabic, but
I know.
I'll let it slide. I'll let it
I,
slide.
I, I even heard it when I said it and I was like, oh, dang it.
So I mean, you must have encountered a lot of VC success stories along the way, as well as some companies that didn't necessarily make the cut. But for you yourself, what was the greatest failure that you personally have overcome while on the journey to providing services in the VC world? I know that you've had to learn to apply your skills, so perhaps there's something provides, I guess, use the skills that you developed in research to apply them to a VC context. But I guess overall, were there any points where you kind of stumbled and didn't know what you were doing, and how did that change your entire experience?
Yeah, I think, I've been pretty lucky on this journey. When I started with the Nair Labs on the service side, we were just establishing, so we were really early. So we didn't even know what we didn't know yet, and we're working with startups, but we were ourselves were also a startup. So that was a very interesting journey. And I spoke about this a little bit when I was talking about the bioinnovation masters I did and the intimidation to the languages. And I think that was one of the biggest challenges I had when I kind of dove into thin air. I was intimidated by the language. I was intimidated by business concepts that I'd never even come across before. I'd never had to look at cash flow statements and profit and loss and like look at the books and do budgeting and things like that. And that was really new for me. And I've absolutely loved learning everything that I've learned, and I continue to learn every day. Like I joke about this all the time, and I'm like, every day I think I get a grip on something, something new pops up, and I learn something new all over again, which I absolutely love. But I think some of the biggest challenges we have day to day is, we just want to help founders. We want to help them win. We want to help them grow. We want to do what we can. And realizing that you can't be all things to all people is one of the hardest things. So like refining who we can work best with, who we can create the biggest successes with. Um, and really honing in on that. And there are a lot of other services out there for entrepreneurs, especially in the early stages in Calgary and in Alberta. There's a thriving ecosystem here, so I think leaning on the ecosystem and finding our own niche was probably one of our biggest challenges, which we've overcome now, which is amazing. And some of the biggest successes we've had, it's been incredible. Like one company, a medical device company here in Alberta called True Angle, we were able to help them with grants that they needed support on and bring in, hundreds of thousands of dollars that's going to support their next stage of growth and help them, bridge their next financing round. You're kind of you're playing for real stakes there. These are real impacts that these companies are making, and you're just helping them get to the next stage. And that for me it's so important, and it's something that I guess it keeps me up at night because I want to make sure that we do a really good job and not have failures. And we've been lucky so far.
That's fair enough. I guess my other question would be, you said that when you joined Thin Air, it was kind of a startup helping startups. Why go with Thin Air Labs? What made it so special as someone who was, looking for a job outside of medicine with outside of, sorry, research with industry? Um, I mean, there must have been something that drew you to the firm in particular.
Yeah, it is. It's a very special place. I was very drawn to it, and there's a couple of things. I liked the structure of what they were setting up, actually. I really liked that they had the venture capital arm. They've had people with a lot of experience in, starting companies. James Lockraiser, our capital partner, and he had huge success with Wave Financial. But I also liked that they recognized that, founders need more than just a check. They need the services and the support like a warm blanket. And that's what the services, the original kind of idea with them was. We have both, the funding catalyst where I work and the product traction service. And that was the idea that they would help portfolio companies. And then we realized, there's actually a lot more pull from the market. There's a lot more companies that need the services that we're putting out there. And that was really exciting. But from Thin Air as a whole, it was the people. Everyone in Thin Air loves founders. We all want to see them win. We're all grateful to be here we're motivated by their founder journey, and we have immense empathy um, for the founders, and truly just want to help them give their gift to the world, whatever that is, and the impact. You hear a lot of bad things about VC firms in the same way you do about, pharmaceutical industry. There's a lot of bad press about VCs because, they're chasing the next dollar and they're only in it for the money. Whereas what I love about Thin Air is the focus on impact and creating real human impact. And obviously we want to get the investment return as well as creating the human impact. But we don't think those things are mutually exclusive. We think you can do both. And in fact, we think that one feeds the other. And it's a very compelling narrative. And it's something that really drew me in. And then what's kept me here is that it's true. And that's the way
Mhm.
everyone operates on a daily basis in here.
That's a very like empathetic perspective on VC. You're absolutely right. And what's really interesting is I remember, so I interviewed your colleague Crystal just recently, and she had mentioned that empathy is also something that she looks for in her interactions in the VC world. So, how important is empathy in VC, or is it something that's just nice to have?
Yeah, for us, it's huge because, we're betting on founders. And I know that the capital team, they truly value the founders that they're interacting with. And we see it on the services side too. And it's hugely important to be empathetic towards them. Founders are the center of all of our stories. They're the ones with the amazing innovation. They're the ones that are, working 24/7 and pushing this forward. And a lot of the folks in Thin Air like that are working here have started companies, have been in the founder's seat before, have raised capital, have gone through this journey before and know what it's like. So they want to be able to share their successes and what worked for them, what didn't work. The failures are, just as important, if more important than the successes at times. So I think having that immense founder empathy, nobody knows a business better than a founder. And no one's gonna, drive the business forward except the founder. So for us, the empathy is a huge component of what we do. And I actually think it's really crucial. We look at when we invest in a company or when we're working with companies, we look at it as a partnership. We want to be there with them. We want to, like I said, live those successes and, take those failures and learn from them every day. So I think that empathy is really crucial.
So what you're saying is that empathy takes the form of kind of like a guiding partnership that you know the essentially Thin Air, um, I guess, is part of and uses to follow along the journey with the companies at hand, so that they're well supported and so that the needs that the companies have are perhaps better stated and better met.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want to tell them how to run their businesses, right? We just want to support them and give them the resources or help them in whatever way we can for them to succeed and get to the next stage. We just
Mhm.
want to see these founders win. We want to see, primarily, or at least initially, we want to see Alberta win. There's a lot of talent, there's a lot of innovation here,
I'm
and
sorry, British Columbia, for the win.
nope. And we're really excited about what's happening in Alberta. You don't hear about it a lot. You're hearing about it a lot more lately. And I think Calgary can be the next big thing.
I'll resolve to differ on that.
Literally.
Um, but I guess you've seen a lot of like med tech and biotech come through, or I guess I'm assuming that you have come through your offices and meetings. What's the, I guess, biggest trend that you've seen among these startups that you're most excited about?
Yeah, we certainly have worked with quite a number of med tech and biotech companies. I mean, there's a couple I'm really excited about, actually. Precision medicine is obviously huge right now.
Hmm.
And it's kind of the future of medicine. Everyone's talking about it. But for me specifically in there, I'm really excited about screening tools. Like, I just think it's been a space that it's it's needed innovation. It has been innovating, but it just seems like it's kind of exploding lately. It's amazing to see how the advancements in different imaging or different types of tests could really kind of revolutionize this field. One of our portfolio companies, Cyantra, I've been working with for a while as well. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they've developed a blood test for the detection of cancer, and it's really effective. And their first product is in the detection of breast cancer. So from a simple blood test, it's with over 90% accuracy able to detect the presence, kind of a yes, no of whether breast cancer is present. And this is going to be huge, that traditional approaches to breast cancer detection, like mammography and things like that, they have limitations. And this could be really revolutionary. I'm so excited to see where this company goes. And then the other one is the medical device space. Medical devices are really blowing up right now, and I think, especially with all the advances in tech, not just from the hardware perspective, from software perspective, remote monitoring, how that field is all, especially driven, I think, even faster by COVID. Um, I think that space is just ripe with innovation, and we see a lot of innovation in that space. And I think it's really interesting to see now as well that companies, you see products that you wouldn't immediately think that they're a medical device, but they're being classified as so because of the way the technology is advancing or the composition of what's in it. Good example of this is a company we've worked with, or sorry, a portfolio company, Nanotest. They developed a salve to promote the healing of chronic wounds, but the composition is actually nanotechnology. I'm not actually sure 100% what they are, but you wouldn't typically think of a salve being a medical device, but because of the nanotechnology components or the composition of it, it's classified, and they got Health Canada approval as a medical device to promote wound healing. It's incredible. You think of all the medic or chronic wounds in the world and the impact that this company could have. It's amazing. I'm excited.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like there's a whole plethora of different trends from screening to treatment that you're interested in. I guess, I mean, maybe a good question to ask to kind of close off this little segment is, what specific services like are you most proud of in developing within Air? Because when you mentioned medical device, my immediate thought was regulation. And look, regulation is super important when it comes to making sure that devices are safe to use. I don't want a salve that burns off my face,
Yeah.
personally. I don't know about you. But I think that like there's as a result of these strict controls, like there's a whole burden on companies to be able to, go through all these regulatory hurdles to get to market. But that burden itself also restricts some companies that may not have the funding or expertise necessary to jump through the hurdles. So like, do you do much in the way of, regulatory support within air? Is that something that you're hoping to do, or what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, right now we're not in the regulatory space. It could be something we'd look at in the future. It's definitely something I'm very interested in for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. It can be such a hurdle to get past it, and that space is so controlled, and rightfully so. But it can definitely challenge innovation. I think on Funding Catalyst, what we do that can help in that respect is, we're all about funding. So what we do is we focus on non-dilutive funding. So are there sources of grant funding? Is there, debt funding that you could go after? Are there rewards or competitions that come with a prize pot? And just helping founders really maximize the finance that they have in the business. So even if they raise some capital, how can you extend that runway by leveraging various forms of grants? And then when you talk about the regulatory path, there are grants and there are projects that you can do and get grant support for that support your path to Health Canada or FDA or CE mark, and getting all those approvals. It's sometimes it's funding for a clinical validation study because you need to increase the number of patients that you've worked with in order to get enough proof to go to and do your first submissions. So there's a lot of support like that we help founders with, and that's that impact of that grant funding. It doesn't, when you say, oh, it's $100,000 grant, sounds great. But if it's $100,000 grant to support clinical validation study, that's the last piece of the puzzle to get to, Health Canada approvals. The impact of that is huge. And I think that's why, everyone on my team, particularly not just in the health or med space, that's why we show up every day. These are the kind of the impacts and the wins that we're trying to create for the founders that we're working with and their
Hmm.
teams.
Hmm. So to wrap this all up, if you were to be able to go all back to the future on yourself and jump back in time to talk to young Katie for 15 seconds, what advice would you give yourself?
Yeah. We sent me this question earlier and I had a good think about it. And what I came up with was just believe in yourself. I know it's cheesy, but I think there's so much imposter syndrome within academia, and it really breeds it. I certainly carried mine into the business world, and it took me some time to believe in myself, the value that I bring to the table, even in this, new, um, kind of in this new place that I'm in this new world of business. I didn't understand how the value that I had and having that belief when I came here. And it was really the team at Thin Air that has really helped me, unlock that potential and working with all these incredible founders that we do. I think that would be the biggest advice I would give. And I would give it to any scientist. I think just believe in the work that you're doing and the skills that you're building and value those.
Hmm. And I guess the last question would be, is there anything in particular that you're proud of that you're working on right now that you want to share with the listeners before we sign off?
I think I'm just proud of everything we're working on, to be honest. I know this again, it's kind of a non-answer answer, but like I said, we're working with over 35 companies and I just value the impact of every single one of them. I'm not going to sit here and give you each and every project that we're working on, but
You're
it's
not?
been no, I could, but it would be a long podcast. But being able to help the founders grow or hire someone really exceptional to their team, and we also have our product traction team, and they help companies, build product or validate the products, and being able to work side by side with those folks as well, and just to double the impact. Because sometimes it's, we can point out funding that might be able to support a project and use our product team, and it's double the impact then, where you're kind of subsidizing the cost of them being able to create or do exceptional work with our product teams, and the way we can, marry all the skill sets we have in the team to try and create the best outcomes.
All right. And I guess listeners, thanks for listening to this podcast with Dr. Katie Greene. My name's Jeff. This is How It's Med, and you can find our podcast at howitsmed.com or any of your podcatchers that you listen to this podcast to. Till next time.